Hi guys, Adam here from Guitar Village, and I'm absolutely delighted today to be presenting to you some of the new National Resophonic resonators that we've got in stock at the moment. Over the course of this video, I want to take a quick look at the history of National, the original corporation and the newer National Resophonic Corporation, go over some of the famous models that National produced and the newer ones that are now available, and play a few tunes for you as well. So let's get into it. So the original National Corporation, that's really the company that created the resonator guitar as we know it today. The resonator guitar, it was a product of the time really, and a product of necessity. So back in 1925 or so, there were the Doppiera brothers in California, and that was Rudy and John Doppiera. Now both of them were immigrants to the US who had made a bit of a wave in the music industry already. They'd patented some banjo designs and had set up a new music shop in California, selling banjos under the National name, as the banjo was the popular instrument of the day. Around about 1925 or so, a vaudeville entertainer by the name of George Beecham wanders into the shop and starts talking about his need for a louder acoustic guitar. Now this had been something that had been a bit of a concern for acoustic guitarists for a few years now, especially playing in orchestra pits, in bands, especially with the rise of jazz music and sort of embryonic swing music that was becoming a bit more popular. The acoustic guitar was just being lost in the mix. And a lot of the times, guitarists would go across to the banjo and use the banjo as a bit of an alternative, but people wanted to really preserve the sort of the sweetness and the more mellow tones of the six strings. So George Beecham, he'd been encountering these same problems, goes across to John because he knew that John had a bit of a history of filing patents and creating new designs for improved instruments. So the first attempt to create a louder guitar, George was really scouting around for something like an electric guitar, which at that time wasn't even a thing. And they came across two different ideas. You had mechanical amplification and you had electrical amplification. So George had tried to create his own style of electric guitar, kind of a strange embryonic thing back in the day, where he'd created a high nut Martin that used to play lap style and use a bar for his Hawaiian style of music. And he took part of a microphone, attached it up at the nut to try and give it a bit more of a louder sound. Obviously back in the early 20s when he did this, amplification was also in its infancy, and so the results were fairly disastrous by all accounts. So talking to John, they had this idea to make use of what was called a Stroh violin. Now Stroh was an English company that had created violins with big conical horns on, kind of similar to like a phonograph or an old Victrola from back in the day. And they're very strange looking things, still around today. And in fact, you can hear one, I'm sure, on a few Tom Waits albums as well. He's used a Stroh violin now and again. So I'd definitely recommend having a listen to those to see what they sound like. And essentially the whole idea of this was you take the violin, attach essentially a phonograph horn to it with something like a resonating diaphragm that you're likely to find in these resonators, and try and project the sound a bit more. The result of this was that they created this big walnut-bodied guitar with a horn apparently sticking out of the bass. Now, there's no photographs of this, but the descriptions are fairly vivid, and as I'm sure you can imagine, the results only went one way. So it's back to the drawing board for John, and he came up with this idea of making use of the burgeoning phonograph technology of the day. And a big part of the phonograph technology were these resonating diaphragms, which George, in fact, presented to John as a bit of an idea. And so the idea kind of formed slowly but surely, and originally John took kind of an OM shape sort of Martin, created the body out of metal, as the diaphragm that he was going to be using was aluminium, and he wanted the vibrations to be preserved as much as possible in order to make sure no sound was lost in transmission from the cone to the body, or from the diaphragm to the body. He attached a little aluminium bridge as well, just to make sure that there was no loss of vibration there. and voila, he created the Resonator. Now it's obviously a bit of a potted history, a bit of a gloss. He originally created a guitar with 3 diaphragms. They're known as the tricone guitars, which you can still get hold of today. But the ever more popular single cone soon came about, essentially as using 1 cone rather than 3 was a little bit more cost effective for the company. Now the 2 guys, John and George, who really together created the Resonator guitar, although John was pretty much, he was the inventor of the guitar and George was very much just the visionary behind it, they were pretty much polar opposite in terms of personality. So John was very much a conservative individual. He was an inventor and a tinkerer and an engineer who liked precision and he liked accuracy, and he was very keen to create perfect products that weren't wasteful in any way, and this was in terms of money and in terms of products as well. Apparently one of his big issues back in the day was making sure that National weren't wasting sandpaper, because they used to go through reams and reams of sandpaper and he wasn't satisfied with the amount that they were using. And remember, this was in the mid-20s. I mean, the National String Instrument Corporation was founded in early 1927 as the official corporation. The idea had come about a little bit earlier, but the actual corporation was founded officially in early 1927. This was the mid-roar of the Roaring Twenties, the middle of the Roaring Twenties. There was apparently lavish parties, or lavish parties, I should say, that George used to finance and used to organise. There were, plenty of reports of bootleg whiskey being found around the original National factory, and lots more money than John and George had ever really envisaged. Now, this really created a kind of tension, because George, as a vaudeville entertainer, as someone who just wanted a louder guitar in order to entertain more people, he was of course over the moon with the results. But by late 1928, John had pretty much had enough. He kind of said, he'd kind of decided that the heyday of National had really been and gone, and it'd become a bit more of a behemoth than he was enjoying operating. There was also lots of tension between the 2 individuals. John's conservatism versus George's kind of more lavish personality really came to a head when George started trying to file patents under his own name when they were allegedly blatantly inventions that John had come up with. And so John left the company in 1928, 1929, and eventually National kind of went the way of a lot of companies during the Great Depression as the Great Depression approached. They survived through to 1943, and throughout the 1930s created some really interesting guitars. Many of them of the single cone design that we've got here. Lots of the Stylo guitars, for example, the Trioleans, the Duoleans, all these famous names, they really came about in the 30s. But by 1943, the company was wound up and it was dissolved and merged and turned into the Valco Corporation. Now, people may be familiar with Valco as an amplifier company. That's how they originally started. They'd kind of adopted the original idea of George back in the early and mid-1920s of creating an electric guitar, and ran with that a few years later. George, incidentally, I should say, got involved very heavily with Adolf Rickenbacker in 1931 and helped Adolf design and create and eventually launch what's known as the frying pan, which is the first commercially available electric guitar. So George's vision for electrical amplification really came to a head throughout the 1930s and then onwards as Valco took off. Valco also split and divided and merged into various other companies that may be familiar to you, so Airline, companies like Supro, companies like Harmony and Kay became very heavily involved with Valco, and eventually even brands like Dan Electro all kind of sort of traced their lineage back through Valco. So that's really a bit of a potted history of National. It's a confluence of 2 different individuals, a creation of necessity, a creation of its time, of the 1920s. You can see the heavy sort of Art Deco inspiration that goes into these guitars. And of course, we now have the fantastic National Resophonic Corporation. So the guitars that we have in stock at the moment and the guitars that we arrived fairly recently, they're not from the original National company. Now there's a bit of confusion when it comes to Resonator guitars over the National name. People will use National to refer to the original National Corporation that existed 1927 to 1943. But they'll also use it to refer to the new National Resophonic Corporation, which is currently in business and is currently producing these guitars. there's no real connection in terms of company lineage between National Resophonic, the newer company, and the original National Corporation. Instead, National Resophonic was set up in 1989 by a chap called Don Young, who sadly passed away a few years ago, who originally got a job at Dobro and decided he could do it better and pay better tribute to the original design of the National Resonator guitar. Don, incidentally, getting a job at Dobro, had started working for John Doppiera's second company. So John Doppiera, the inventor of the Resonator guitar, after he left National in the late 20s, went on to form Dobro. Now Dobro is a Slavic word that means good, and John was originally of Slavic origin. And there are also 5 Doppiera brothers, which, you know, D-O-B-R-O, hence why he set up Dobro as a bit of a rival to National. So Don in the 60s and the 70s got absolutely inspired by the Resonator guitar. He saw an original National tricone in a pawn shop window, heard recordings by legendary bluesman the Black Ace, who I'm also a big fan of, and decided that that's what he needed to do. He needed to go and create these guitars. So National Resophonic first came about in 1989, still in business today, and ever since have been producing these fantastic instruments that really pay tribute to the original designs of the original National company. So much so that Don, in fact, even managed to track down the original presses for the cones and for the bodies that they'd used in the original National factory, but he arrived 2 weeks too late before they were put into the crusher, the steel crusher where he'd found them at the scrapper's yard. So, bit of an unfortunate timing there, but just shows you how much he was inspired by that company and by the guitars they produced. So, without much further ado, I think we should take a look at some of the models we've got in at the moment, some of these fantastic things that National Resophonic are producing, and play a few tunes and see how we get on. This first one that I'm holding is part of the Raw series from National. Now the Raw series is really kind of inspired by those older guitars that you're likely to have seen people like Son House and Booker White play. So in the Raw series you're going to find Resonator guitars that have really minimal treatment to the metalwork here. They're rubbed down with a bit of wax and that's about it. The idea of these guitars is really that they're going to distress with time, they're going to patina and become completely unique instruments. Very much inspired by some of those juke joints or resonators that you would have seen Booker White and Son House and guitarists like that play upon their rediscovery in the 60s. So if you want a guitar that's going to wear to the way that you play and really look the part in a few years' time, then of course this is the one to go for. Next up, we've got the weathered steel resonator from National. So as you can see, this one's got a little bit of patina already. It's been aged a little bit to make it look like one of those tube joint guitars again. Absolutely stunning neck on this guitar as well. I just want to show you that. This really stands out against the patina they've put on there. You'll notice the slotted headstock on this guitar as well. When it comes to National resonators, when you've got a slotted headstock, typically you're going to be holding a 12 fret guitar. Now all of these guitars come in 12 and 14 fret options. And so this is obviously the 12 fret version I'm holding here. Again, it's very minimal treatment apart from the aging that's been put onto the metal work here. So again, this guitar is going to wear to how you play and age over time as well. I'm holding here probably one of the most famous resonator guitar models of all time. This is the Stylo, the 14 fret with a solid headstock. And for all you Mark Knopfler and Dire Straits fans out there, this is of course the model that's featured on that famous Brothers in Arms album cover. Now on this guitar you've got the Hawaiian sandblasted scenes, which were on the original 30s stylos from the original National company, and which National Resophonic have replicated absolutely fantastically on these guitars here. Now the reason for these Hawaiian scenes was that during the late 20s or maybe even early 20s and into the early 30s, there was really a craze for Hawaiian music in the United States. There were famous musicians such as Sal Hopi, for example, who was an early ambassador and endorser of National guitars, and you can sort of see these sandblasted scenes as a tribute to both those kinds of musicians and that fantastic era of American music, which really produced these fantastic instruments. Okay, so as a little bonus, we have here another stylo, but this one is the stylo Replicon from National Resophonic. Now it's the same 14 fret solid headstock as the stylo I showed you, the one that's been featured on Mark Knopfler's or Dire Straits' Brothers in Arms album cover, but this one's just been made to look a little bit older. It's been relicked a little, and I have to say it's a pretty convincing job. Already a really decent patina established on this metalwork here, a little bit of wear to the neck, so it's nice and comfortable to play, and it's, you know, it's a pretty unique one-off guitar, this one, so very excited to have this in the shop at the moment. So we've taken a look at some of the models that National Resophonic have been producing. We've also taken a quick look at the history of National Resophonic and the original National Corporation. So at this point there's a couple of questions that I'd like to address. First up is, why should anyone buy a resonator guitar at all these days? As I said in the original history section that we went through, the resonator guitar can really be seen as a bit of a bridge between the acoustic guitar and the electric guitar. Now these days there's plenty of electric guitars to choose from, a much louder amplification that you're ever going to get off of what is essentially an acoustic instrument. So why should anybody buy one? Well, I think first up, we just need to have a look at the instruments, and as we've demonstrated a few of them, I hope you'll agree that they are stunning looking instruments. There's no company really, I think, that pays as much attention to the detail of a resonator, and National really get it right with all the Hawaiian scenes and all the etchings that you're going to see on some of these models. Second of all, of course, is that they have each resonator guitar has a very distinctive tone, so there are certain styles of music that are just going to sound best with a resonator instrument. Things like your Delta blues, if you're fans of Sun House, Booker White, Blind Boy Fuller, these kinds of people, they all use resonator guitars. If you want to get into your Hawaiian slide music, as we say, there's the chap Sal Hopi, who used to play an original tricone. These kinds of sounds have become embedded in these genres, and there's really no replicating them. Last of all, there's a very practical reason why you might want to buy a resonator, and that is of course for the original intention of them. Say you're somewhere where you can't plug into an amplifier but you need an acoustic guitar that's going to cut through the mix a bit more. The mechanical amplification aspect of these guitars still works, and you know, as Tom here was discovering, they can be quite loud instruments, and so they can cut through the mix just that little bit better than your standard acoustic guitar. So the second question that I want to address is, why should you choose National Resophonic over another resonator brand? There are plenty of companies out there doing cheaper resonator guitars, for example, and doing different models than you're going to find in the National Resophonic catalogue. So why go for National? I think an important aspect of this is to remember that these guitars are all handmade out there in sunny California, so they are absolutely top of the tree when it comes to resonator instruments. As we say about the attention to detail on them as well, that is second to none. And as a personal anecdote, I do play a slightly cheaper resonator guitar that I've got at home and had it for many years, and it always feels like quite hard work to play. There is a bit of a stereotype with resonator guitars that they're a little bit harder work than your standard acoustic guitar. You know, they fight back a little bit more. But that is certainly not the case with National Resophonic, as I hope I've demonstrated today. They're excellent fun, and they just really feel like a fantastically made acoustic guitar. And the bonus, of course, is that you get that fantastic, biting, distinctive tone that you're only going to get off of one of these guitars. So anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this video, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure for me to do it. As always, the guitars will be in the description box below the video. Like and subscribe, and tune in next time.